Tonight, we're going to talk about a fortress that was taken without a single sword being drawn, about a scholar who built an empire of fear with almost no soldiers, and about a name that has echoed through 8 centuries of legend, whispered in the courts of sultans, embroidered by travelers, and finally handed down to us, so distorted by rumor that the truth beneath it has become almost unrecognizable. We are going back to the mountains of northern Persia, to a valley so hidden and so high that eagles were said to nest below its walls, and to a group of men and women who, for nearly 200 years, held the great powers of the medieval world in a slow and patient grip. Before we go on, if you find something restful in these long, quiet histories, you might like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly gives you comfort. There is no need otherwise. And if you feel like it, leave your city and your local time down in the comments. There is a small, pleasant magic in knowing that somewhere on the other side of the world, in another hour of the night, someone is settling in to hear the same old story you are. So make yourself comfortable now. Dim the lights. Rest your head. Let the day slip away from you, and let us begin with a man who could not sleep. The year was 1092. The place, a tent pitched along the road between Nishapur and Baghdad, in the heart of the great Seljuk Empire. Inside the tent lay the most powerful minister in the Muslim world, a man named Nizam al-Mulk, the vizier of the Sultan Malik Shah. He was old now, in his 70s, and he had governed the empire for more than 3 decades. He had written the great manual of statecraft that Persian kings would consult for centuries. He had founded schools that trained the finest scholars of the age. He was, by every reckoning, the second most powerful figure between the Nile and the Indus, and in practical matters, often the first. On that autumn evening, as he was carried by litter toward Baghdad, a young man in the coarse robes of a wandering dervish approached him with a petition, the kind of small favor a passing traveler might beg of a great minister. Nizam took the paper. The dervish drew a blade from beneath his cloak and drove it into the vizier's chest. The guards cut the young man down at once, but the deed was already done. Nizam al-Mulk died there on the road, and within weeks the Sultan himself was also dead in mysterious circumstances, and the greatest empire in the East began to shudder and crack from the inside. The killer had not tried to flee. He had not even seemed to consider it. He had struck in full public view, expecting death, and by every account welcoming it. And when the guards searched his body, they found no gold in his purse, no letter from a foreign king, no sign of any earthly bribe. He had done what he had done for something the world could not weigh in coin, and for someone the world had barely begun to notice. He had been sent by a man in a fortress high in the mountains of Persia, a man who had once been Nizam al-Mulk's own friend, and who now, from a stone eagle's nest called Alamut, would in the years to come teach every ruler between the Mediterranean and the Oxus to sleep lightly, to eat carefully, and to fear the shape of a shadow beside the bed. Tonight we are going to follow that man, and the strange, disciplined, and grievously misunderstood community he built, from its beginnings in a scholar's quiet books, through the taking of a fortress by conversation rather than by siege, through the long and delicate war it fought with the great powers of Islam, through the arrival of a storm from the east that not even Alamut could withstand, and finally through the moment when the whole story was very nearly lost. When the sect's greatest library burned, and its enemies were left to write its history for it. We will meet a scholar who begged to save a single book from the flames, a Venetian traveler who spun a tale of drugged gardens and secret paradises that has haunted the imagination of Europe ever since, and a modern community, still living, still numerous, still peaceful, that quietly descends from the very people whose name once made emperors tremble. But we have to begin at the beginning, and the beginning belongs, as so many beginnings do, to a young man reading late into the night. To understand him, we have to understand his world, and the world of the 11th century in the Islamic East was not the calm, unified caliphate of later imagination. It was a world of 2 great rival powers, each claiming to be the true guardian of Islam, and neither willing to concede an inch to the other. From Baghdad ruled the Abbasid caliphs, ancient in prestige, but by this time little more than ceremonial figures, and behind them stood the real strength of the age, the Seljuk Turks. They were a family of warrior sultans who had swept down out of Central Asia only a few generations earlier, and had built for themselves an enormous empire stretching from the borders of Byzantium in the west to the mountains of Afghanistan in the east. The Seljuks were Sunni Muslims, fiercely so, and their scholars and viziers, the greatest of whom was Nizam al-Mulk himself, worked hard to bind the empire together under a single orthodox faith. They built schools, they trained judges, they patronized preachers, and they treated any rival current of Islam as a danger to be watched, curbed, and where possible, driven quietly out of the towns. Far to the south and west, in Cairo, ruled the other great power. The Fatimids had built a caliphate of their own in Egypt about a century and a half earlier, and they claimed descent from the Prophet's daughter Fatima and her husband Ali, which is why they called themselves what they did. They were Shia Muslims of the branch known as Ismaili, and they held that the true leadership of the Muslim community had never belonged to the caliphs of Baghdad at all, but to a hidden line of imams, of whom the Fatimid caliph in Cairo was the living representative on earth. To the Sunni Seljuks, this was heresy of the most dangerous kind, because it did not merely dispute a doctrine, it disputed the legitimacy of every ruler between Anatolia and India. To the Fatimids, the Seljuks were usurpers standing between them and their rightful rule over the whole of Islam. The two powers had been at cold and sometimes hot war with one another for generations, sending armies, spies, missionaries, and money across the frontier in a slow contest that touched every city between the Nile and the mountains of Iran. Now, in the towns and villages of Persia itself, and especially in the rugged provinces along the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, there lived pockets of Ismaili Shia who had never quite fit into the Sunni order that the Seljuks were building around them. They kept their beliefs quietly, sometimes secretly, and they looked with hope toward Cairo, where a caliph of their own faith still sat on his throne, sending out missionaries in every direction. These missionaries, called deis in the Arabic of the age, were not soldiers. They were teachers, philosophers, and patient organizers trained to walk into a town, find the receptive minds among its scholars and its merchants and its restless young men, and win them over one careful conversation at a time. They worked slowly, they worked in secret, and they were extraordinarily good at what they did. It was into this world, and into this network, that a boy was born in the middle of the 11th century in the city of Qum in central Persia, and given the name Hassan. His family were Shia of the sober and cautious kind that kept their heads down under Sunni rule. As a boy, Hassan was brilliant, restless, and hungry for learning, the sort of child who reads far ahead of his teachers and asks questions that are not always welcome. He was sent for his education to the town of Ray, which stood not far from where modern Tehran stands today, and there in his teenage years he encountered for the first time a serious Ismaili missionary, a man patient enough to sit with a curious young scholar and lead him slowly through the arguments of a faith that promised deeper meanings behind the plain surface of the world. Hassan resisted at first. He argued. He read the counter-arguments. He tested the missionaries' answers against the works of the Sunni theologians, and he found, night by night and month by month, that the answers held. In his own later account, which survives to us in fragments preserved by a hostile historian, he described his conversion as a long and deliberate process, ending in a nearly fatal illness in which he thought he might die, and out of which he rose committed for the rest of his life to the Ismaili cause. He was not a man who did things by halves. Once he had made the decision, he threw himself into the network of missionaries with the same intensity he had once brought to his books. He worked his way up through the ranks of the local deis, impressing his superiors with his learning and his discipline, and by his mid-20s, he was considered so promising that he was summoned to make the long, dangerous journey westward, across the Seljuk lands, through Syria and down into Egypt, to see the great Fatimid capital of Cairo for himself, and to be presented at the court of the Ismaili caliph. What he saw there, and the quiet, private disappointment that turned him from an ordinary missionary into something altogether new, and the strange idea he carried back with him through the mountains toward a certain hidden valley in northern Persia, is where the story truly begins to bend toward Alamut. And to that journey, and to the fortress that would become his home, his workshop, and his monument, we shall turn in the next section when you are ready. The road from Persia to Egypt in the year 1078 was a long one, and it was not an easy road for a man of Hassan's persuasions. He had to cross the whole width of the Seljuk Empire, whose sultan and vizier would have gladly seen him imprisoned had they known who he was and what errand he carried in his mind. He travelled quietly, in the manner of a wandering scholar, keeping his own counsel, sleeping in caravanserais along the great trade routes, moving through Isfahan and then westward toward the frontier. He was in his early 30s then, lean and dark, with the particular kind of stillness that came from years of disciplined study, and he had the trick, useful in his line of work, of being easily forgotten by the men who had just spoken with him. He passed through Azerbaijan, crossed into northern Syria, and made his way down through the coastal cities of the Fatimid frontier, and after nearly 2 years of travel, he stood at last within the walls of Cairo. Cairo in those days was one of the great cities of the world, larger and more prosperous than any capital of the Christian West, and to a serious young Ismaili, it must have felt like walking into the heart of every hope he had carried since his conversion. The Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir was upon his throne, an old man now, but still the living imam whose spiritual authority Hassan had crossed a continent to acknowledge. There were great libraries in the city, and colleges of the faith, and quiet gardens where the missionaries who served in the caliph's cause gathered to discuss doctrine and to plan the slow spread of their teachings across the wider world. Hassan was received and honored and given lodging, and for something close to 3 years he remained in Egypt or in its Syrian dependencies, listening, learning, and being trained more deeply in the arts of persuasion that he would soon put to such extraordinary use. But something happened in Cairo that he never spoke of freely, and which the hostile chroniclers who came later could only guess at. He fell out of favor with a powerful man. The Fatimid state in those years was not a peaceful place. The old caliph was fadding, and the real power at court lay with the vizier and the army commanders, and there was a bitter and half-concealed dispute over which of the caliph's sons would inherit the imamate when the old man finally died. The elder son, Nizar, was the natural heir, and the missionaries who came from the east, including Hassan, seemed to have favored him. The vizier, however, meant to place the younger son upon the throne, for a younger and less experienced ruler would be easier for a vizier to manage. Hassan, always sharp of tongue, seems to have argued too openly for the elder prince, and he found himself very quickly declared unwelcome. He was arrested, some accounts say. He was placed upon a ship bound for North Africa, and only a storm at sea that drove the ship back onto the Syrian coast saved him from a still darker fate. Whatever the exact details, he left Cairo carrying 2 things. He carried a firm conviction that the true imamate belonged to the elder line, to Nizar and his descendants, and he carried a growing suspicion that if the Ismaili cause was ever going to prevail in the east, it would have to prevail without much help from Egypt, and perhaps without any help at all. He came home to Persia in the early 1080s, and he came home changed. The young scholar who had gone out was now a man in his late 30s who had seen the inside of the greatest Ismaili court in the world and had left it disillusioned. He no longer wished merely to be one missionary among many, working slow conversions in the towns of the Sunni Empire and reporting back to superiors in a distant Cairo. He had begun to think about something that no Ismaili missionary in Persia had ever seriously attempted. He had begun to think about a base of his own. Not a city, for cities were full of the Sultan's men and could not be defended. Not a province, for provinces would draw armies down upon them the moment they were declared. What he wanted was something smaller and stranger and much more difficult to reach. He wanted a fortress. Or rather, he wanted a network of fortresses, hidden in country so rough that no Seljuk army could pursue him into it, from which his missionaries could go out into the plains and the towns and the mountains, and to which they could always return. He began to travel through northern Persia, quietly, patiently, walking the ridgelands and the river valleys, sizing up the country the way a merchant sizes up a market. He was looking for a particular kind of place. It had to be defensible by a very small garrison, because he would never have many men. It had to be near enough to the great roads and the great cities that his missionaries could reach them within a few days' ride. It had to lie in a region whose population was already sympathetic to the Shia cause, so that his followers could move among the villagers without being betrayed. And above all, it had to be beyond the easy reach of the Seljuk armies, so that when the Sultan finally understood what had been done, it would already be too late to undo it. His eye came to rest at last upon a valley in the Alborz Mountains, the great range that runs east and west along the southern shore of the Caspian Sea, dividing the lush green forests of the coastal lowlands from the dry Persian plateau to the south. This was a country of steep gorges and dizzying passes, of villages tucked into folds of the hills, of a population of stubborn mountaineers who had never really been ruled by anyone and who had for centuries preserved their own dialects, their own customs, and often their own quiet Shia sympathies against the Sunni order of the plains. And in the middle of this country, upon a great narrow spur of rock, rising some 600 feet sheer from the floor of a hidden valley, there stood a castle. It had been built long before, in the 9th century, by a local Zaydi lord, and its name in the local dialect meant something like the eagle's teaching, or perhaps the eagle's nest, for a story was told that its founder had followed a hunting eagle to the spot and had understood at once that no better fortress could ever be built. The castle was called Alamut. Hassan looked at Alamut, and he understood exactly what he was looking at. The rock upon which it stood was accessible by only a single narrow path that could be defended by a handful of men against an army. The valley below was fertile enough to feed the garrison from its own fields and orchards, and it was watered by a swift river that no besieger could easily divert. The castle itself, though it needed work, held storerooms cut into the living stone that could hold provisions for years. And around it, in the surrounding hills, lay a scattering of villages and smaller strongholds that could be brought over one by one into the same quiet network. If a man could take that castle and could hold it and could bind the surrounding country to himself, he would have something no missionary of his faith had ever possessed in the Sunni East. He would have a home that could not be taken from him. There was only one difficulty. Alamut belonged to someone. It was held by a local Arlid lord named Mahdi, a man of some Shia sympathies himself, but very much the sort of local aristocrat who valued his own castle and had no intention of handing it over to a wandering preacher who had appeared at his gate with a satchel of books and a burning idea. A conventional missionary or a conventional conspirator would at this point have gone to Egypt for money, hired a small army of mercenaries, and attempted to take the castle by force, which would very likely have failed. Hassan did nothing of the sort. He did what he had always done best. He set out to persuade. He did not go to Alamut himself, not at first. He sent two of his most trusted dais ahead of him into the valley, carrying nothing but their arguments and their patience. They took service quietly in the surrounding villages, teaching in the small mosques and the schools, making friends with the local elders, listening more than they spoke. When the villagers had come to trust them, they began, gently and privately, to explain the Ismaili teaching, to describe the hidden imam and the deeper meanings behind the outward forms of the faith. The villagers listened, and many of them found in these teachings something that matched a longing they had never quite been able to name, and they were converted, one household at a time. From the villages, the missionaries moved inward, up the paths toward the castle itself. They befriended the guards. They spoke with the servants. They talked quietly among the men of the garrison, who had never before been offered so patient and so learned a teacher, and who had time in a mountain fortress of all things is what you have plenty of. Within a year, perhaps two, a substantial portion of the men living inside Alamut had, without their lord's knowledge, become followers of a faith he did not share. Only then did Hassan come. It was, by tradition, the 4th of September, in the year 1090. He entered the castle in the disguise of a schoolteacher named Dahuda, hired to instruct the children of the garrison, and for some months he lived among them quietly, letting Mahdi grow accustomed to his gentle, unremarkable presence, letting the last of the doubters in the garrison come around to his teaching. Then one day, at a moment he had chosen with great care, he simply revealed himself. He told Mahdi calmly that the castle was no longer his, that the men who guarded its walls were no longer his men, that the country around it belonged now, in its heart, to another lord, and that lord was Hassan I Saba. Mahdi, who was neither a fool nor a coward, looked about him, spoke to his captains, spoke to his guards, and understood in a single terrible afternoon that Hassan was telling him the plain truth. Every door he tried had been closed against him long before he knew there had been a contest. He did not fight, because there was no one left to fight for him. He accepted, with what dignity he could muster, the strange offer his conqueror now made. Hassan drew a draft upon a friendly merchant in a nearby town, a formal note of credit for 3,000 gold dinars, a substantial sum, roughly the fair market price of a strong castle in that country, and he handed it to the man he had just dispossessed. It is said that the merchant, upon reading the signature at the bottom of the note, honored it at once. Mahdi rode out of Alamut a poorer man in castles, but a richer man in coin, and Hassan-I Sabah, without a single sword drawn or a single arrow loosed, was master of the fortress from which, for the next 35 years, he would not once descend. He would not need to descend, because from that same rock, in the very next year, he would begin the quiet campaign that would make his name a whisper of terror in every court between Baghdad and Damascus. He would begin, that is, to teach the great powers of the age what a man with almost no soldiers could do to a man with a great many, if he chose the moment and the place and the single decisive blade with sufficient care. The Alamut into which Hassan-I Sabah settled in the autumn of 1090 was, to a visitor arriving for the first time, a place both stern and strangely beautiful. The rock upon which the castle stood ran along its ridge for nearly a quarter of a mile, narrow and knife-backed, so that a man walking its length felt the drop on either side as an almost physical pressure at his ribs. To the north, the peaks of the Alborz rose in serrated ranks, their upper slopes white with snow even in summer, and to the south, far below, the green fields of the valley spread out along the river, dotted with the small mud brick villages whose people had, without any of them quite noticing it, become his subjects. The castle itself was long and low, hugging the shape of the ridge, its walls climbing directly from the living stone as though they had grown out of it. There were storerooms cut deep into the rock, cool and dry, in which grain could be kept for years without spoiling, and a system of cisterns that gathered the snowmelt from the mountains above and delivered water down into the fortress by a series of channels so cleverly worked that no besieger could ever hope to cut them. There was also a garden, small but carefully tended, where fruit trees grew in the shelter of the walls, and this quiet garden, which was nothing more than the ordinary garden of a mountain lord, would in later centuries become the seed of one of the strangest legends ever told about the place. Hassan set about his work immediately, and the work was of two kinds. The first was practical and unglamorous, and it consisted of turning Alamut and the country around it into something that could feed itself, defend itself, and survive whatever the great empires of the age might eventually throw against it. He commanded the terraces below the walls to be extended and improved so that more grain and fruit could be raised. He ordered new cisterns to be cut into the rock, deeper and larger than any that had existed before, so that in a long siege the garrison would never lack water. He sent his engineers and his most trusted followers out through the neighboring valleys, and one by one they took possession, sometimes by conversion and sometimes by simple negotiation, of the other small castles that dotted the region, until within a very few years the whole tangle of ridges and gorges south of the Caspian formed a chain of Ismaili strongholds, each within a day's ride of the next, each supporting the others. Later, agents of his would go still further, west into the mountains of Kurdistan, and even eventually into the coastal ranges of Syria, where a separate branch of his order would take root and become the assassins that later European crusaders would encounter and remember. The second kind of work was invisible from the outside, and it was the work upon which everything else would depend. Hassan set about creating, upon the rock of Alamut, a school. Not a school of the ordinary kind, which trained boys in grammar and jurisprudence, but a school for men, chosen carefully, who would be sent out into the great cities of the empire as missionaries and as agents of the cause. He gathered his own books around him, and he sent word out through the network of dais that any promising student of the faith and any scholar in trouble with the Sunni authorities in the towns would find a welcome and a place to work upon the mountain. Slowly, the library of Alamut began to grow. Merchants passing through the neighboring valleys brought manuscripts up along the mountain paths on the backs of mules. Scholars fleeing persecution in Nishapur or Isfahan or Ray climbed the narrow track to the castle gate and were taken in. There were philosophical works, treatises on astronomy and mathematics, medical books, poetry, and of course, the vast literature of the Ismaili tradition itself, which had been accumulating for centuries. Within a generation, the library of Alamut would be spoken of, quietly and with some awe, as one of the finest collections of learning in the whole Islamic East, rivaled only by the great libraries of Baghdad and Cairo. It is one of the small tragedies of what would happen much later that we know so little of exactly what stood upon its shelves, because almost none of it survived. For himself, Hassan lived with an austerity that surprised even his own followers. He took a small chamber within the castle. He kept his books, his writing materials, and very little else. He ate simply. He wore the plain woolen clothes of a scholar. He is said, upon fairly good authority, to have executed one of his own sons for drinking wine, which was forbidden by the faith he taught, and another for a suspected involvement in an assassination he had not authorized, and after these acts he never spoke of either boy again. He did not leave the castle. Not once in the 35 years that remained to him did Hassan-I Saba descend from the rock of Alamut. He did not ride out to inspect his other fortresses. He did not travel to receive envoys. He did not go up onto the roof to look out across his mountains for pleasure. He remained within his chamber and his library, writing, teaching, and directing by letter the vast, delicate work of his order. And by the time he had been there for a decade, the great powers of the empire were beginning to understand that a very unusual sort of neighbor had installed himself in the hills above them. The reaction of the Seljuk state, when it finally came, was slow, and when it came, angry. For the first few years after 1090, the Sultan and his vizier had other troubles to occupy them, and the mountain sect above the Caspian was one nuisance among many. But by the beginning of 1092, the situation could no longer be ignored, because Hassan's missionaries had begun to appear in the settled towns of the plateau, and small local disturbances were breaking out in cities as far south as Isfahan and as far east as Kohistan, where whole districts were quietly declaring themselves for the new faith. Nizam al-Mulk, the great vizier who had run the empire for 30 years, now turned his attention seriously to the problem, and he did what a vizier in his position would naturally do. He raised armies. He sent one force under competent general against Alamut itself, with orders to storm the castle and hang its lord from its own walls. He sent another force into Kohistan, where the Ismaili communities were most exposed, with orders to burn the villages and disperse the population. And he wrote, in the great manual of statecraft he had been composing for the young Sultan Malik Shah, a long and bitter chapter on the danger of what he called the heretics, urging that they be pursued into every valley and rooted out root and branch, for otherwise, he warned, they would grow into a peril that no army could reach. He was right about the peril. He was wrong, catastrophically wrong, about how it could be reached and how it would reach him. The army sent against Alamut struggled up through the passes in the summer of 1092 and found, as many armies would find in the years to come, that the castle could not be taken by any conventional means. The path to its gate was too narrow for a siege engine. The rock was too steep for a mine. The garrison, though small, held every advantage of position, and the surrounding villages, being all of them now converts to the new faith, would give the invaders no food and no shelter and no local intelligence. The army sat below the walls through the autumn, achieving nothing, and when the first snows began to close the passes, it was forced to withdraw. The other expedition, into Kohistan, did somewhat better in the sense that it burned a number of villages and killed a certain number of people, but it did not extinguish the local Ismaili community, which simply melted back into the hills to be reconstituted the following year. While the Sultan's armies were achieving nothing in the mountains, Hassan-I Saba, in his small chamber upon the rock of Alamut, had been thinking very carefully about a different kind of warfare. He understood, only a few hundred fighting men in his entire order scattered across dozens of small fortresses. He could not match a great empire soldier for soldier. He could not stand in the open field. He could not even, given his own vow never to leave the castle, lead his men in battle himself. What he had instead was a group of extraordinarily devoted young followers, trained from adolescence in the disciplines of his faith, willing to accept any mission he gave them, willing even, when the mission required it, to die. And what he had understood, in the long nights of the previous winter, was that the great empires of his age were held together not by their armies, which were huge, but by a very small number of men at the top who ran everything, and that if a single one of those men could be reached at a single unguarded moment, the effect upon the whole vast machinery below him would be out of all proportion to the effort of reaching him. He summoned a young man named Tahir Arani, who had come to Alamut some years before from the town of Aran, and who had already been marked out as a man of unusual devotion. He explained what he wanted done, and he explained how it must be done, in the open, in daylight, in the presence of many witnesses, so that everyone in the empire would understand at once who had done it and why. Tahir listened, and asked no questions, and made his preparations. He left Alamut in the early autumn of 1092, and he travelled south and west across the empire, through the plateau and down toward the great road that ran between Nishapur and Baghdad, where at that season the court of Sultan Malik Shah was slowly making its way toward Baghdad for the winter. In the baggage train of the court travelled the vizier Nizam al-Mulk, old now and weary, carried in a litter between his household guards. Tahir dressed himself in the coarse robe of a wandering Sufi, the kind of pious mendicant whom no one would think dangerous. He carried a written petition, as any humble subject might who wished to bring some small grievance before a great minister. On the 14th of October in the year 1092, the court camped for the night in a village along the road, and the vizier's litter was set down near his tent, and Tahir stepped forward from the crowd of onlookers, holding out his paper with his head bowed. The old man leaned out to take it, and the young man's other hand came up with a blade, and the thing was done. The guards, roused a second too late, cut the assassin to pieces on the spot, which was exactly what he had expected them to do, and what he had come there to accept. The blow fell upon the empire like a hammer upon glass. Within a month, the Sultan Malik Shah himself was also dead, in circumstances the chroniclers would argue about for centuries, and which no one has ever definitively settled. And with the sudden loss of both the vizier and the sultan, the great Seljuk state, which had seemed the most solid power in the world, began at once to fracture into the civil wars of the sons and cousins and generals who fought for what remained of it. From his chamber upon the rock of Alamut, Hassanai Saba, who had never lifted a sword in his life, watched the largest empire between the Nile and the Indus tear itself in two, and he understood that he had discovered a weapon whose true power was only beginning. For the men who governed the Islamic East in the years after 1092, the world had changed in a way that was very difficult to name. The armies were still enormous. The treasuries were still full. The great cities still rose in their glory of tile and minaret from Baghdad to Bokhara. But something in the private life of every powerful man had shifted, and the shift was subtle enough that at first only the powerful men themselves felt it, and then only in the moments before sleep, or in the middle of the night, when a footfall in the corridor outside their chamber seemed to hesitate a fraction of a second longer than it should have. The Seljuk state, torn open by the double loss of its sultan and its vizier, spent the next decade tearing itself apart in a civil war between the sons and brothers of the dead ruler. And while it was so occupied, Hassanai Saba, from his chamber upon the rock of Alamut, extended his network quietly in every direction, adding fortresses, adding villages, adding, most importantly of all, agents planted in the households and the retinues and the guard corps of every man who mattered between the Oxus and the Mediterranean. He had learned something in the killing of Nizam al-Mulk that no ruler before him had understood, or at any rate had ever admitted openly. He had learned that the fear of a thing is very often a more useful weapon than the thing itself. He had spent, in the killing of the great vizier, precisely one life, the life of Tahir Arani, whom he had trained and prepared and sent out with a full knowledge of what would happen. And in exchange for that one life, he had received not merely the death of an enemy, but a currency he could spend upon every other enemy for the rest of his own days. Every sultan, every vizier, every governor, every commander of a garrison who now heard the name of Alamut or the name of Hassanai Saba felt a small cold breath at the back of his neck and understood that if he acted too energetically against the sect in the mountains, a young man with a blade might one day appear beside his litter as well. And that fear cost Hassan nothing at all, because it was doing its work continuously, in every court and in every camp, without requiring him to lift so much as a finger. He learned very quickly, moreover, that the fear could be sharpened and directed by gestures far less costly than a killing. This was the discovery that would echo down through the centuries, and that would gather about it, in time, a great many stories which are not quite true, but which grew from a habit that certainly was. Hassan understood that if a man in a position of power woke one morning to find a dagger driven into the floorboards beside his pillow, or laid neatly upon the cushion where his head had rested, together with a small note in a plain hand explaining that the blade could as easily have found his throat, that man would from that day forward be a somewhat different man. He would still command his armies. He would still sit in his council. He would still ride at the head of his cavalry when the campaigning season came. But there would be, in the quiet of his own bedchamber, a new understanding of what he was and was not able to do. And Hassan understood further that the placing of a blade upon a pillow required no death at all. It required only an agent, patient and unknown, who had sat for months or years in the man's own household as a servant, or as a cook, or as a groom, and who had chosen his night with care. There were, in the decades that followed, a great many such nights. The stories that survive of them come to us mostly through the writings of the sect's enemies, which means they must be read with a certain caution, but the pattern is consistent enough across too many sources to be doubted in its outline. A powerful lord would open a campaign against the Nizaris, as the followers of Hassan called themselves, for they held the elder line of the Fatimid Caliph Nizar to be the true imamate. He would send his troops against one of their fortresses. He would issue proclamations against them from the pulpit of his own mosque. And then, at some morning of his choosing, he would wake to find upon his person, or beside his bed, or driven into the wooden post at the foot of it, an object that had not been there when he lay down. Sometimes it was a dagger. Sometimes it was a piece of bread or a cake, laid where his hand would find it in the darkness, so that the recipient would understand that his food, as well as his sleep, lay open to strangers. Sometimes it was a written message in the plain Persian of the mountains, courteous in its wording, explaining that this particular course of action was regarded with disfavor by the master of Alamut, and might it please the recipient to consider whether it was worth pursuing. The message was always signed, or as good as signed, by the very fact of its arrival, for no one else in the world was reaching into the private chambers of great men in this way. The response of the great men once the first shock had worn off was almost always the same. They stopped whatever they had been doing. They recalled their armies. They abandoned their proclamations. They sent, quietly and by trusted intermediaries, a message back into the mountains offering some accommodation, some understanding, some quiet coexistence, and Hassan, from his chamber upon the rock, was almost always willing to grant it. He was not, at bottom, a man who wanted a great empire of his own. He had no interest in ruling Baghdad or Cairo. He wanted only that his order should be left alone in its mountains, that its missionaries should be permitted to go about their work in the plains, and that the villages and the fortresses that had come over to him should not be harassed. The great powers, having other and larger business to attend to, and having no wish to spend the rest of their lives sleeping with one eye upon the door, found on the whole that they could live with these terms. Not all of them, however, learned the lesson at once, and it was in the second decade of the 12th century that Hassanai Saba found himself facing an opponent as patient and as determined as he was himself. This was a new Seljuk Sultan, a grandson of the old Malik Shah, named Mohammed Tapar, who had emerged from the long civil war as the strongest of the surviving princes and who understood, with a clarity that his father and uncles had not possessed, that the sect in the mountains could not simply be beaten in a single campaign, but must be worn down, year after year, by patient and continuous pressure. Mohammed Tapar sent his armies against Alamut in 8 successive summers, one after another, marching them up through the passes as soon as the snow melted, and pulling them back down again when the autumn closed the roads. His generals could not take the castle, for no army had ever been able to take it, but they could burn the fields in the valley below, and they could plunder the surrounding villages, and they could make the ordinary life of the Nizari community in those valleys extremely difficult. By the 8th summer of this pressure, the granaries within Alamut were beginning to run low, and even the vast cisterns and the deep storerooms could not entirely compensate for the loss of harvest after harvest in the fields outside the walls. There was, in the castle, some quiet talk that the situation was becoming grave, and one of Hassan's captains is said to have suggested, very carefully, that the master might consider a temporary withdrawal into a still remoter refuge until the Sultan's attention turned elsewhere. Hassan, according to the story, listened to the suggestion in silence, and then answered that he had entered Alamut with his own 2 feet, and he would leave it, if he ever left it, only when he was carried, and the captain did not raise the matter again. Then, in the spring of 1118, the Sultan Mohammed Tapar died, quite peacefully in his bed, of an ordinary illness, and no one has ever seriously suggested that Hassan-I Sabbah had anything to do with it. The Sultan's sons at once fell into a fresh quarrel over the succession, and the great effort against Alamut, which had been on the point of finally telling, was abandoned in a single season, never to be resumed with the same seriousness by any Seljuk ruler again. From within his chamber upon the rock, Hassan received the news with one imaginese, a quiet nod, and turned back to his books. He was an old man now, past 70, and his own end was not far away. He had ruled Alamut for 34 years, and he had never once stepped outside its walls. He had outlived 3 sultans of the great Seljuk Empire, and he had outlived every one of the enemies who had first laughed at his taking of the castle in 1090. He had watched the Ismaili community in Egypt, from which he had once been expelled in disgrace, split into pieces after the death of the old Caliph al-Mustansir in 1094, when the vizier in Cairo had passed over the elder son, Nizar, exactly as Hassan had feared he would, and had placed the younger son upon the throne. Nizar himself had been imprisoned and killed shortly afterward. And Hassan, from his chamber in the mountains, had declared at once that the Nizari community would follow the elder line, that they would not recognize the Caliph in Cairo, that their true imam was Nizar's own son, whom they held to have been smuggled out of Egypt and hidden away in safety, and that until this hidden imam or his descendant should reveal himself to the world, the leadership of the community would rest with Hassan and with those he trained to succeed him. So the Nizaris became, formally, an independent branch of the Ismaili faith, cut off from Cairo, self-governing from the mountains, waiting upon a hidden imam. Hassan-I Sabbah died in his chamber in the late spring of 1124. He had, in the final years, chosen a successor from among his most trusted lieutenants, a man named Buzurg Umid, whose name meant great hope, and who had proven himself over decades in the running of the order. The transition, when it came, was so smooth that the outside world barely noticed it. Alamut went on. The missionaries continued to move through the towns. The daggers continued, from time to time, to appear beside the pillows of men who had grown too bold in their opposition to the sect. And within a generation, in a land far to the west, in the coastal mountains of Syria, where the branch of the order had taken root that European crusaders would come to know, a new master would rise whose reputation would in some ways eclipse even that of the founder himself, and who would one day face across a Syrian frontier the most famous Muslim commander of the entire medieval age, and would leave him, one memorable morning, with a certain object upon his pillow. The Syria into which the Nizari order extended itself in the early years of the 12th century was a country very different from the mountain valleys of northern Persia, and yet, in one crucial respect, it was remarkably similar. It too contained a spine of rugged coastal mountains where central authority reached only with difficulty, where the villages spoke their own dialects and preserved their own quiet heterodoxies, and where a determined missionary of the Ismaili faith could find, if he was patient enough, a great many receptive minds among the local population. This range, which the Arabic geographers called the Jabal Ansariya, and which ran along the Mediterranean coast between the plain of Antioch in the north and the plain of Tripoli in the south, would in time hold nearly a dozen small castles under the black banner of the Nizari order, and it would produce, in the middle of the 12th century, a master whose reputation in the outside world would rival that of Hassan Sabah himself. The Syrian branch of the order had been established quietly, in the way that Hassan had established everything. Missionaries had gone west from Alamut in the early 1100s, walking the long roads through Anatolia or coming by ship to the Syrian ports, and they had begun the slow work of conversion in the towns and villages of the coastal range. They had faced, in Syria, a difficulty they had not faced in Persia, for the country was divided among a bewildering patchwork of powers. There were the Sunni princes of the interior, ruling from Aleppo and Damascus and Hama, each of them a Turk or a Kurd who had risen through the ranks of the old Seljuk armies. There were the great Christian principalities that the First Crusade had planted along the coast, the county of Tripoli and the principality of Antioch, whose Frankish knights rode down out of their high stone castles to raid the Muslim countryside. And there was the memory, still fresh in every village, of the Fatimid Caliphate to the south, whose armies had once held the whole coast and who still ruled from Cairo. Into this tangle the Nizari missionaries went, taking service where they could, teaching where they were welcomed, and gradually, over 3 decades, buying or converting or seizing outright a handful of small castles in the mountains, which they linked together into a network on the Persian model. The greatest of these Syrian fortresses was a place called Masyaf, which stood upon a rocky outcrop rising some 600 feet above the surrounding plain, commanding the passes between the coastal mountains and the interior. It had been an ordinary local stronghold, held by a minor Arab family, until the Nizaris acquired it in 1141, and thereafter it became the effective capital of the Syrian branch of the order, its Alamut in miniature. And into this castle, around the middle of the century, came the man who would become known to history by the title his followers gave him, Sheikh al-Jabal, the Master of the Mountain, though the European crusaders, when they heard the phrase, misunderstood it and translated it as the Old Man of the Mountain, which is the name by which he passed into every chronicle of the Latin West. His true name was Rashid al-Din Sinan, and he was, by the standards of his order, an outsider. He had not been born in the Syrian mountains, but in a village near Basra in southern Iraq, and he had come to the faith as a young man, made his way east to Alamut for his training, and there had spent nearly 20 years in the presence of the masters of the order and in the great library upon the rock. He had studied philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and the deeper doctrines of the Ismaili tradition. He had been marked out from an early stage as a man of unusual ability, and when the leadership at Alamut decided that the Syrian branch of the order needed a strong hand to hold it together against its many enemies, Sinan was chosen and sent westward, arriving in Syria sometime in the 1160s. He would rule the Syrian Nizaris from Masyaf for the next 30 years, and he would prove to be, in his own quiet way, one of the most remarkable political figures of an age that was not short of remarkable political figures. Sinan was in his prime when the greatest of those figures came onto the stage. Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom Europe would remember as Saladin, was a Kurdish commander who had risen through the service of the ruler of Damascus, and who by the year 1171 had made himself master of Egypt, extinguishing the Fatimid Caliphate there and restoring the country to Sunni obedience. He was, by every account of friend and enemy alike, a man of formidable ability, patient in his campaigns, generous to his defeated enemies, deeply pious in his personal life, and utterly determined upon a single great object, which was the unification of the fractured Muslim world under his own authority, so that it could at last drive the Frankish crusaders back into the sea. For any patient observer sitting upon the rock of Masyaf, Saladin was a great deal more than an ordinary Sunni prince. He was a man building an empire, and empires in the process of being built are, historically, unfriendly to small independent sects that will not bend the knee. The trouble between them began, in the manner these things often begin, over small matters. Saladin, extending his authority northward from Egypt into Syria in the middle 1170s, could not easily tolerate the existence, in the very mountains through which his supply lines ran, of a network of fortresses that answered to no one but a master in a distant castle. There were border incidents. There were disputes over the taxation of villages that lay in the disputed country between the Nizari holdings and the lands that Saladin's officers claimed. There were, so the sources tell us, attempts by Sinan's agents upon the life of Saladin himself, though the details are murky and the accounts differ in important particulars. What is clear is that by the year 1176, Saladin had decided that the sect could not simply be lived alongside, and that he must do what the Seljuks in Persia had once tried to do, which was to bring an army into the mountains and reduce the fortress at the heart of the network by sea. He came up against Masyaf in August of that year with a substantial force. The castle sat upon its rock, small compared to the great fortresses of Aleppo or Damascus, but well provisioned and steeply approached, and Saladin's engineers went to work with the professionalism that had made his armies famous. They cut trees for siege engines. They surveyed the approaches. They set patrols to prevent supplies reaching the castle from the surrounding villages. Sinan, from within, made the usual arrangements for a long defense, and sent quiet word out through his network that all Nizari missionaries and agents in Saladin's own retinue should now consider themselves activated. And then, at some morning in the second or third week of the siege, Saladin awoke in his own tent, at the head of his own army, surrounded by his own picked guards, and found beside him, laid neatly upon his pillow, 3 objects. The exact nature of the objects varies from chronicler to chronicler, and this is one of those episodes in medieval history where every version is a little different from every other version, which is often the sign that something did in fact happen and that no one afterward could quite agree on the details. In the most commonly repeated account, there was a fresh cake of the kind eaten in the Nizari communities, still warm from a baker's fire. There was a small dagger of the plain workmanship favored by the order, and there was a slip of paper, upon which was written a line of verse to the effect that what could be taken could as easily be taken away, and that the recipient of these gifts might wish to reflect upon the fact that the hand which had left them beside his sleeping face could as easily have chosen otherwise. It is a matter of record that Saladin, that same morning, rose from his tent, gave orders that the siege be lifted, and led his army back down out of the mountains, and it is a matter of further record that he never again in his life, in a life that had many campaigns still ahead of it, marched a soldier against the Nizari order in Syria. He and Sinan appear to have reached some kind of quiet accommodation in the years that followed, the details of which have not survived, but which held for the remainder of both their lives. There is a further curiosity to this episode, which is worth pausing over, because it tells us something important about how the order was seen and misseen by the people around it. Saladin himself never spoke publicly about what had happened in his tent. He did not describe the incident in his letters. He did not commission a chronicle of it. His own great biographer, Baha al-Din ibn Shaddad, who served him for decades and left one of the finest personal accounts of any medieval ruler, treats the whole Masyaf campaign with an odd delicacy, mentioning that it was ended by a truce and passing on to other matters. The details, such as we have them, come mostly from writers sympathetic to the Nizaris themselves, or from later hostile writers who elaborated upon rumors, and this is a pattern we shall meet again and again as the story goes on. The order preferred to work in silence, and its enemies preferred not to admit that anything embarrassing had happened to them, with the result that the historical record is full of gaps into which, over the centuries, all manner of colorful stories have been poured. Among those colorful stories, one in particular had begun by this point to attach itself to the order, and it is worth pausing over as well, because it would in time grow into the single most persistent legend the sect ever attracted. The word had begun to circulate in the Sunni polemical writings of the 12th century that the young men whom the Nizari masters sent out on their most dangerous missions, and who accepted death with such extraordinary calm must be under the influence of some drug. The particular drug named in these writings, more often than not, was hashish, the resin of the cannabis plant, which was known in the Islamic world of the age, and which had a reputation, in the popular imagination, for producing states of dreaminess, euphoria, and disconnection from ordinary reality. The polemicists began to call the followers of the sect hashishiyya, users of hashish, as a term of contempt, meaning something like drug-addled fanatics, dupes of a master who had chemically enslaved their wills. There is no serious evidence that the Nizaris actually used hashish, and every serious reason to doubt it, for a discipline as demanding as theirs would have been quite impossible to maintain among men who were regularly intoxicated. The word was a slur, and it was understood at the time as a slur, but the slur travelled. It attached itself to the order in the Arabic sources, and from there, when European crusaders and travellers began to write about the sect in their own languages, it passed into Latin and French and Italian in a slightly garbled form, and became the word assassin. And eventually, in the centuries that followed, this word would detach itself from the sect altogether and become the ordinary word by which any hired killer in any language of Europe would be known. But before that final generalization, in the late 13th century, a Venetian traveller passing through the ruins of the order's power in Persia would hear the old slur and would decide, in the manner of travellers everywhere, that it deserved a better story, and he would give it one. The Venetian traveller was Marco Polo, and the story he told about the assassins is, in almost every respect, the story that the modern world thinks it knows about them. It is worth pausing over, because it has done more to shape the popular imagination of the Nizari order than any other single document ever written, and because almost none of it is true, and because the small kernel of possible truth at its center has been buried so deep beneath the embroidery that recovering it requires a certain patience. Marco Polo passed through the country that had once belonged to the order in the year 1273, or thereabouts, as a young man of 19 or 20, traveling with his father and uncle on the long overland journey from Venice to the court of the great Khan in China. By that date, the Nizari state in Persia had been extinct for 17 years. Its castles had been thrown down, its libraries had been burned, its master had been executed, and its surviving followers had scattered into the mountains and the villages, going quietly to ground under the new Mongol overlords of the country. What Marco saw as his caravan passed through the region then was not a living community, but the ruined stone of empty fortresses upon their peaks, and the memory of the order as it had been preserved in local storytelling, which by then had already had several generations to grow luxuriant and strange. He listened to the stories, as any curious traveller would. He noted them down, or remembered them, and years later, when he was dictating his great account of his travels to a fellow prisoner in a Genoese jail, he set them out in a form that would enchant every reader in Europe for the next 600 years. The tale that Marco Polo told ran, in essence, like this. There was, he said, in the mountains of Persia, a certain great lord called the Old Man of the Mountain, whose name was Alodin. This lord had caused to be constructed, in a hidden valley between two high peaks, a garden of surpassing beauty. It was, Marco said, the loveliest garden that had ever been made, planted with every fruit tree that grew, decorated with pavilions of gilded and painted work, watered by streams of wine and milk and honey and clear water, so that whichever of these a man wished to drink, he had only to bend down and drink. And in this garden, he said, were kept the fairest young women of the country, trained in music and dancing and every art of pleasure, so that any man admitted to the garden might believe himself to have been transporting, while still living, into the paradise that the prophet had promised to the faithful in the life to come. When the Old Man of the Mountain wished, Marco continued, to make a young man into one of his devoted killers, he would first have the youth drugged with a certain potion, so that he fell into a deep sleep, and while he slept, he would be carried into the garden. There he would awaken among the flowers and the fountains and the young women, and he would spend some days in a condition of perfect bliss, believing that he had indeed been received into paradise. Then he would be drugged again and carried out, and would awaken once more in his ordinary chamber in the fortress, and would be told by the old man of the mountain that he had been granted a glimpse of what awaited him if he served his master faithfully unto death. And the young man, longing to return to that place, would from that moment onward do whatever his master commanded, and would go joyfully to be killed if the killing was ordered, because he believed that his death was only a doorway back into the garden he remembered. It is a marvelous story. Marco Polo was a good enough writer to know a marvelous story when he heard one, and he set it down with all the color and confidence that his memory could summon. And it has, in the century since, been repeated in 1,000 books, painted in 1,000 pictures, dramatized in 1,000 plays and films and games and poems, until the drugged garden of false paradise has become inseparable, in the popular mind, from the very idea of the assassins. There is only one difficulty, which is that no serious historian believes it happened. There is no reference to any such garden in any of the sect's own writings, and the writings of the sect that survive, though few, are enough to make clear that the young men of the order were not motivated by any promise of drugged pleasure gardens, but by a deep and disciplined religious devotion of a perfectly recognizable Islamic kind. There is no reference to it, either, in the hostile writings of the sect's Muslim enemies, who would have been only too glad to seize upon such a detail if it had existed, and who instead spread the different slur about hashish that we saw in the previous section. There is no reference to it in the writings of the Crusader knights and clerics who had direct dealings with the Syrian branch of the order across many decades, and who wrote a good deal about it. It appears, so far as our sources can tell us, for the first time in the pages of Marco Polo, more than a century and a half after the order had begun, and nearly 2 decades after its Persian state had been destroyed. And it appears in the words of a young traveller passing through a country where the ruins of the fortresses stood empty, and the local villagers had every reason in the world to tell colourful tales about the men who had once lived in them. What almost certainly happened, and this is as close as we can come to the small grain of truth beneath the embroidery, is something like this. The fortress of Alamut and the other Nizari castles did, as we have seen, contain gardens. Every mountain fortress of any pretension in that country contained a garden, because a garden was one of the small civilized comforts by which the isolation of a life upon a rock could be made bearable. The gardens of Alamut, as they are described in the more sober Persian sources, were the ordinary gardens of a Persian nobleman, with fruit trees and vegetable beds, and a channel or two of running water, admirably tended by the standards of a working mountain castle, but in no way resembling the enchanted paradise of Marco Polo's account. In the villages of the surrounding country, in the decades after the order had been destroyed, it was no doubt sometimes said, in the way that villagers everywhere talk about the great families that once ruled over them, that in the days of the masters there had been gardens up on those rocks, gardens fit for kings, gardens more beautiful than anything remaining in the country now. And it may be, too, that some memory of the old slur about hashish had found its way into the local storytelling, so that a garden and a drug and a fanatical devotion to death had all been tangled together in the folk memory of the region by the time Marco Polo's caravan came through. He took the tangle and he made a story out of it, and the story became famous, and the story is what most people, if asked today, would tell you about the assassins. The truth about how the order actually trained its young men is at once less colorful and, in its own way, more interesting. It is preserved for us in part in the writings of the sect itself, which survive in fragments, and in part in the more careful and less sensational accounts written by their Muslim contemporaries, and it describes a discipline that any modern reader who has thought about the training of monks or of certain kinds of soldiers will find recognizable. The young men who came to the order came, in most cases, from Nizari families who had been part of the community for generations, and they had grown up in the faith. They were taught from childhood the doctrines of the Ismaili tradition, which held that the outward form of religious law had a hidden inward meaning, that this hidden meaning was revealed by the succession of the imams, and that the community of the faithful stood in a special relationship of loyalty and obedience to the living representatives of that line. They were taught to fast, to pray, to keep long vigils, to accept the authority of their teachers, to memorize long passages of theological argument. Those who showed the greatest promise were brought closer to the inner life of the fortresses, where they studied philosophy and mathematics and astronomy in the libraries that Hassanai Saba and his successors had assembled, and where they were taught, over years of patient formation, the deeper mysteries of the faith. Only a small number of them, from among the most trusted and the most devoted, were ever selected for the missions of the kind that had ended the life of Nizam al-Mulk, and that had left the dagger beside Saladin's pillow. And those who were selected went, so far as the evidence permits us to judge, in a spirit of religious devotion rather than of chemical intoxication, believing that their obedience was owed to the Imam and that their death, if death came, would be the death of a martyr in the oldest and most respected sense of that word in the Islamic tradition. They were called within the order Fid, a letter to Beis, which meant, in the Arabic of the age, those who offer up their lives, and the word was in no way peculiar to this sect, but had been used for centuries in the Muslim world for any warrior who accepted a mission from which he was unlikely to return. It carried, in the language of the faith, no connotation of trickery or drugging or false promise, but only of a religious offering freely made. What set the Fid, a letter to Beis of the Nizari order apart from other such warriors, was not the depth of their devotion, which was of a familiar kind, but the extraordinary patience with which they were deployed and the specific technique of the single public killing in the presence of witnesses, which we saw first in the death of Nizam al-Mulk, and which the order refined into a signature method over the century and a half that followed. This was a technique, not a drug, and it was practiced with a discipline that would have been impossible to sustain by any means Marco Polo's story would have provided. Yet it is Marco Polo's story that endured, and this is perhaps the deepest thing to say about the reputation of the assassins as it has come down to us. The order lived, in secret and in silence, for nearly 2 centuries. It kept its own counsel. It wrote little for outside consumption. When its enemies described it, they described it with the particular bitterness that the powerful reserve for those who have made them afraid, and they described it in words meant to wound. And when at last the order fell, in a catastrophe that we shall come to soon, its own records were mostly destroyed in the fire, and there was no one left to tell its story from the inside. The image of the drugged garden and the false paradise filled a gap that would otherwise have been simply an absence, and the absence, once filled, was very difficult to empty again. The assassins we think we know are, to a very great extent, the assassins that a Venetian traveller dreamed up in a Genoese jail, 17 years too late to check the story with anyone who would have known. While the legend of the drugged garden was still, in the 12th century, only beginning to attach itself to the order, the real Nizari community was living through what would prove to be the strangest and most theologically remarkable episode in its own history. It happened at Alamut, upon the rock itself, in the summer of 1164, and it left the sect for the rest of its existence a rather different community from the one that Hassanai Saba had founded, though the outside world barely understood what had changed, and the historians of the great powers around the mountain never entirely grasped its meaning. The master of Alamut in that year was a man named Hassan II, the great-grandson of Buzurg Umid, whom the founder had chosen as his successor upon his deathbed. This Hassan had inherited the rulership as a young man, and he was of a very different temperament from the austere scholars who had governed the order in its first 3 generations. He had been raised on the rock, educated in its library, trained in the disciplines of the faith, but he had also, according to those who watched him grow up, been a young man of unusual charisma, quick of speech, warm of manner, given to bold ideas, and possessed of a certain restless conviction that the community he had inherited was living in an incomplete condition, and that some great fulfillment was near at hand. For some years after his succession, he governed the order in the ordinary way, sending out missionaries, corresponding with the Syrian branch under Sinan, receiving envoys from the fractured kingdoms of the plateau below. And then, on a day in the middle of August in that year of 1164, he did something that had no precedent in the order's history, and that no one, in any Muslim community anywhere, had done in quite the same way for a very long time. He summoned the followers of the order to gather in the great open ground below the walls of Alamut, and he had a pulpit erected there, facing westward toward Mecca, and he mounted it in the sight of the assembled community and announced, in the name of the hidden Imam, that the age of the law was ended and that the age of the resurrection had begun. This was not a small statement, and it took the community some time to understand what he was saying, because he was drawing upon a very old strand within the Ismaili tradition, and older strands within the wider Shia tradition, that spoke of a future moment when the outer forms of religious observance would be lifted away, and the hidden inner meanings of the faith would be revealed to the community in their full brightness. The technical word for this moment was the Qiyamah, the resurrection, and it was not exactly what a modern person means by the resurrection of the dead at the end of time, though it was related to that idea. It was, rather, the unveiling of a spiritual reality that had always been present but had been hidden beneath the letter of the law, and its announcement meant, in practical terms, that the ordinary observances of the fast and the pilgrimage and the daily prayer were suspended, not because they had been wrong, but because the community was now to live in a condition of direct spiritual understanding for which the observances had been only the outer preparation. To announce such a thing was, by the standards of any Orthodox Muslim community, an extraordinary step, and the news of what had happened at Alamut passed through the courts of the Sunni princes below with the kind of shock that had once greeted the killing of Nizam al-Mulk 70 years earlier, though this shock was of a different kind. It was the shock of hearing that a heretical sect in the mountains had now declared itself, quite openly, to have moved beyond the shared framework of Islamic practice altogether. Within the Nizari community itself, the response varied. Many followers embraced the declaration with fervor, understanding it as the culmination of the long spiritual journey they had been on since Hassan I Saba's day, and celebrating the Qiyamah with feasts and gatherings that the outside world found deeply scandalous. Others, more cautious, understood the announcement in a symbolic sense and continued to keep the outward observances quietly in their own homes. And a small number, chiefly among the older and more traditionally minded leaders, were disturbed enough that they never fully accepted what had happened. One of these, a brother-in-law of Hassan II, was disturbed enough that within 18 months of the Great Declaration, in early 1166, he came into the master's chamber upon the rock of Alamut and killed him with a dagger, in a private murder that ended the life of the man who had announced the resurrection almost as quickly as the resurrection had been announced. Hassan's son, however, succeeded him and continued the doctrine his father had proclaimed, and after the death of that son, another master carried it forward, and for roughly 40 years the Nizari community lived in the strange condition of a community that had, by the declaration of its own imam, moved beyond the law. But in the early years of the 13th century, a further master named Jalal al-Din Hassan, who had come to the leadership young and who ruled with great political intelligence, made a very different sort of announcement. He declared that the community was returning to the observance of the outer forms of the law, and he wrote letters to the Sunni caliph in Baghdad and to the surrounding princes announcing his own personal adherence to the ordinary Sunni forms of religious practice. He invited Sunni scholars into the fortress of Alamut and had them inspect the library and the daily life of the community. He arranged for his mother to make the pilgrimage to Mecca with a large caravan in the full sight of the Muslim world. And by these carefully chosen gestures, he brought the order back, at least in its outer appearance, into a workable coexistence with the surrounding powers. Whether this was a genuine change of heart, or, as some Ismaili writers themselves later suggested, a strategic accommodation carried out on the principle of taqiyya, the ancient Shia doctrine of prudent concealment in times of danger, the historians are still not sure. What is clear is that Jalal al-Din Hassan's rulership marked the end of the open experiment with the Qiyamah and the beginning of a long, quiet accommodation with the outer forms of Sunni practice, which the community would maintain in its various branches from that time onward. I want to pause here for a moment Before we move on to the darker turn the story is about to take, and speak about what the ordinary daily life of the community actually looked like. Because we have been discussing masters and doctrines and killings for several sections now, and it would be easy to forget that the great majority of Nizaris were not FID, a letter to BEIS, and not theologians, but ordinary villagers going about their ordinary lives. In the valleys around Alamut, in the coastal ranges of Syria, in the small settlements of Kohistan on the eastern edge of the Iranian plateau, there lived tens of thousands of Nizari men and women whose religion was for them simply the religion of their families, held quietly, practiced in the small mosques of their villages, transmitted from parent to child in the ordinary ways in which faith is transmitted anywhere in the world. They were farmers and shepherds and weavers and traders. They raised wheat and barley in the terraced fields below their fortresses. They kept flocks of sheep and goats upon the mountain pastures. They sent their sons down into the towns of the plateau to buy salt and cloth and metalwork. They paid a modest tax to the local castle. They came, once or twice a year, to the great festivals held in the shadow of the walls, when the master or his deputy would address the community and confirm the bond between the rock above and the villages below. They lived, on the whole, more peaceably than their neighbors, under the rule of the surrounding princes, for the Nizari lands were mostly free of the constant petty warfare that plagued the settled country. And they lived, above all, with a strong sense that they belonged to something older and deeper than the shifting kingdoms around them, a community that traced itself back to the prophet through the imams, and that was in some sense the true and inner community of the faith, whatever the outer world might say. The masters, for their part, had by the 13th century built up a system of administration upon the rock of Alamut that was quite as elaborate as anything the surrounding Sunni princes possessed. There were officers responsible for the maintenance of the fortresses, and officers responsible for the collection of the taxes, and officers responsible for the training of the missionaries, and officers responsible for the correspondence with the Syrian branch and with the scattered Nizari communities in more distant lands. There were treasurers and secretaries and chief judges, and a whole apparatus of quiet government run out of chambers cut into the mountain. The library had continued to grow, generation upon generation, and by the time the century turned toward its fatal middle, it contained, upon its shelves, not merely the theological writings of the Ismaili tradition, but a substantial collection of the ordinary literature of the Islamic world, philosophy and medicine, and astronomy and history and poetry, together with a number of works from the Christian and even the Greek and Sanskrit traditions that had made their way east through the trade routes over the years. Scholars in the surrounding princely courts had, quietly, taken to writing to Alamut with requests to consult particular manuscripts, and were sometimes granted the privilege of climbing the narrow path with a letter of introduction and spending a season in the library under the eye of the librarian. It was, in short, by the middle years of the 13th century, a settled community, prosperous within its limits, self-governing, well-defended, and quietly powerful, and it had every reasonable expectation of continuing indefinitely into the future in more or less the condition in which it then stood. The great powers around it, having learned over a century and a half of trial that the fortresses could not be taken by any conventional means, and that any attempt to press the community too hard would result in daggers appearing beside pillows in inconvenient places, had settled into a pattern of watchful coexistence. The order paid a nominal tribute here, received a nominal env there, sent its own missionaries about their business, and kept its own counsel. In the winter of 1255, the community observed the ordinary festivals of its faith, and in the spring of 1256, the sowing of the terraced fields began as it had begun every spring for the previous 166 years. There is no reason to think that anyone upon the rock of Alamut, or in any of the villages below, understood that the world into which their community had been born was already ending, and that from a country far to the east, out of the great grasslands beyond the Oxus, a wind was rising against which no fortress ever built by human hands would prove sufficient. The Mongols were coming, and they were coming in a way that no army had ever come before. The wind out of the east had begun to rise nearly half a century before it reached the walls of Alamut. And to understand what fell upon the order in the year 1256, we have to go back briefly and take the measure of what had happened in those 50 years to the world beyond the Oxus. In the first decade of the 13th century, upon the great grasslands north of China, a chieftain named Temujin had risen through a life of extraordinary difficulty and had, by patient warfare and shrewder diplomacy than his enemies ever quite understood, united under his own command the whole tangled network of the Mongol tribes. In 1206, his followers had proclaimed him Chinggis Khan, which meant something like universal ruler, and within a few years he had begun the campaigns that would carry his horsemen across northern China, across Central Asia, and in the year 1219 into the settled lands of the Muslim East. The empire of the Khwarazmshah, which then ruled from the borders of Iraq to the borders of India, and which was by every reasonable measure the greatest Muslim power of its day, was in a matter of some 3 years reduced to rubble. Cities that had been famous throughout the Islamic world for their libraries and their gardens and their scholars, Bokhara and Samarkand and Merv and Nishapur, were entered by the Mongol armies, and in a pattern that would repeat itself many times, systematically emptied of their populations. The killing was on a scale for which the settled world had no precedent. Villages were burned. Irrigation systems that had taken centuries to build were broken. Whole provinces were depopulated. Chinggis Khan died in 1227, an old man in his own tent, and the great empire he had built passed to his sons and grandsons, who continued the campaigns with the same patient thoroughness, extending Mongol authority westward into Russia and southward into the settled Muslim lands, until, by the middle of the century, only 2 great powers still stood between the Mongols and the Mediterranean. One was the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which had by then been reduced to a shadow of its old self, but which still commanded the loyalty of the Sunni Muslim world as the successor to the Prophet. The other was the Nizari order upon the rock of Alamut. The Mongol Khan, who now turned his attention to these last 2 obstacles, was a grandson of Chinggis, a man named Hulagu, and he was in every respect a formidable heir to his grandfather. He was patient, methodical, brilliantly served by his generals, and he was in this campaign given a particular commission by the great Khan Monk, then ruling from Karakoram, which was to bring the whole Muslim East under Mongol authority once and for all. Hulagu began his march westward in the year 1253, moving slowly, gathering his forces, spending months in each staging area to prepare the next stage of the advance. He brought with him a corps of Chinese engineers skilled in siege warfare, and a great train of siege engines heavier than anything the Persian mountains had ever seen. He also brought with him a substantial staff of scholars and administrators, for it was his intention not merely to conquer the country, but to govern it, and among these men was a Persian historian named Malik Juvini, whose father had served the Mongols already and who had himself risen high in their administration. Juvini was a man of learning, a devout Sunni, and no friend to the Nizari order, whom his own writings would describe in terms of considerable bitterness. But he was also a scholar in the deepest sense, a man who loved books and who understood, in a way that his Mongol masters could not, what the great libraries of the East were, and what would be lost if they were destroyed. His presence beside Hulagu in the years that followed would prove to be one of the small mercies in the story we are now approaching, though it would be a mercy of a very partial kind. The master of Alamut in these years was a young man named Rukan al-Din Kersha, who had come to the leadership in the autumn of 1255 upon the sudden death of his father, the previous master, in circumstances that were murky at the time and that have remained murky since. He was in his mid-20s, inexperienced, and he had inherited a community that was already in an extraordinarily difficult position. His father had for some time been pursuing, with limited success, a policy of accommodation with the surrounding powers, and Rukan al-Din, upon taking the leadership, sent envoys to Hulagu proposing submission and offering to dismantle a number of the smaller fortresses as a token of good faith. Hulagu, however, was not the kind of ruler with whom small tokens accomplished anything. He replied that submission must be complete, that the young master must come in person to the Mongol camp and place himself at the disposal of the Khan, and that all of the fortresses of the order, including Alamut itself, must be surrendered. Rukn al-Din temporized, promising this and delaying that, sending small delegations while trying to buy time to prepare his defenses, and Hulagu, having taken his measure, gave the order to advance. Through the summer and autumn of 1256, the Mongol army moved into the country of the Nizari fortresses, and one after another, the smaller castles fell to the systematic pressure of the Chinese siege engines. Some surrendered upon terms. Others resisted and were reduced by weeks of methodical bombardment. The garrisons were, in most cases, killed. The stones were, in most cases, pulled down. And by the middle of November of that year, Hulagu had brought his main force up into the valley below the rock of Alamut itself, and the fortress that had never been taken by any conventional means in 166 years now stood surrounded by the largest and best equipped army that had ever come against it. Rukn al-Din, seeing what was arrayed below him and reading the fate of the smaller castles as an accurate forecast of his own, made the decision that his position now allowed him to make. He descended from the rock in person under safe conduct and presented himself in the Mongol camp before Hulagu, and he surrendered. The date was the 19th of November in the year 1256. The great fortress of Alamut, which had been the heart of the order since Hassanai Saba had walked into it in the disguise of a school teacher in 1090, passed without a final battle into Mongol hands. Rukn al-Din was received in the camp with a certain formal courtesy, was given a place among the Khan's followers, and was in the weeks that followed sent about the country to command the surrender of those of his own fortresses that still held out, which in most cases he was able to do simply by presenting himself before their walls. A number of the Nizari captains, more stubborn than their young master, refused these instructions and had to be taken by siege in the ordinary way. But the great mass of the community and nearly all of the great fortresses passed under Mongol control by the following spring. And now we come to the moment that is, for anyone who cares about the transmission of learning across the centuries, the most painful in the whole story. Hulagu, having taken Alamut, turned his attention to what was to be done with the fortress and its contents. It was, from a military point of view, the sort of place that a conqueror does not leave standing at his rear, because if it were ever to fall again into hostile hands, it would be almost impossible to take a second time. His decision was that the walls of Alamut and of all the greater Nizari fortresses were to be systematically thrown down. The stones tumbled from the ridges into the valleys below, the storerooms and cisterns and chambers broken open, so that never again should any of these rocks serve as the base of a hostile power. The demolition began at once, and it would take his engineers months to complete it, but the intention was clear from the first day, which was that Alamut was to be reduced to a ruin. Inside the fortress, however, there stood the library. And in that library there stood, upon their shelves, the accumulated books and manuscripts of 166 years of patient collection, together with the works produced upon the rock itself by generations of Nizari scholars, together with the works acquired from Cairo and Baghdad and Nishapur and beyond. And this was, by every account we possess, one of the great libraries of the medieval Islamic world. It contained works whose existence is known to us today only from references in other books, works of philosophy and mathematics and astronomy that had been preserved nowhere else, works of the Ismaili tradition that had been copied and recopied at Alamut over the generations, works of history and geography and medicine gathered from every quarter of the Muslim world. Ata Malik Juvani, the Persian historian in Hulagu's train, understood at once what was upon those shelves and what would be lost if the library shared the fate of the walls. He went to Hulagu and he begged. We have Juvani's own account of what happened next, written in his great history of the Mongol conquests some years later. He describes how he was granted permission by the Khan to enter the library at Alamut and to inspect its contents, and how he passed through its chambers in a state of wonder and grief, seeing all around him the shelves upon which the labor of generations had been gathered. He was permitted, he tells us, to take from the library certain books that he judged to be of the highest value and to carry them away with him for preservation. He took out a number of works, including copies of the Quran and books that he considered acceptable to Sunni orthodoxy, and a small number of scientific and philosophical works of undeniable value. And then, having taken what he could carry away, he stood aside while the remainder of the collection, which was to say the vast bulk of it, was consigned to the flames. The fire at Alamut burned for a long time. The chronicles do not tell us exactly how many days, but a library of that size, in the closed chambers of a mountain fortress, does not burn in an afternoon. The Nizari books, the internal writings of the community, the theological treatises and the correspondence of the masters, and the records of the missionaries, and the philosophical works composed upon the rock, went up in the smoke together with a great many works that had nothing particularly to do with the sect at all, but had simply been part of a great scholarly collection. What we know today of the Nizari order comes to us, therefore, almost entirely from three sources, none of them internal. It comes from the writings of the sect's Sunni enemies, chief among them Juvani himself, who preserved a certain amount of information about the community even as he denounced it. It comes from the accounts of the Crusader chroniclers who had dealings with the Syrian branch. And it comes from the small handful of Nizari writings that survived, either because they were preserved in the more distant communities of the sect that Hulagu's armies did not reach, or because they had been copied out into the libraries of other traditions before the fire. Rukn al-Din himself did not long outlive his fortress. Hulagu, having no further use for him, sent him east toward the court of the great Khan monk, and on the road, in circumstances that were reported at the time with a certain vagueness, the last master of Alamut was killed by his Mongol escort. It was said, unofficially, that Monk had let it be known that the young man was not to arrive. Hulagu did not linger long in the ruined valleys of the Nizari country. He had a further commission to carry out, the one that mattered most in the eyes of his brother, the great Khan. And in the first weeks of the year 1258, he brought his army down out of the mountains and turned it westward across the plateau toward Baghdad. The old Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim, the last of a line that traced itself back 5 centuries to the age immediately after the Prophet, sat within his palace beside the Tigris and refused, until it was far too late, to understand what was coming toward him. Hulagu invested the city in January. He broke into it in February. He caused the caliph to be rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, out of a Mongol reluctance to shed royal blood upon the ground. And the great libraries of Baghdad, which had been the wonder of the Muslim world for 4 centuries, were thrown into the Tigris in such quantities that the river was said, in the accounts of the survivors, to run black with ink for days afterward. The caliphate that had been the political framework of Sunni Islam since the 8th century ceased, in that week, to exist. And it is one of the smaller ironies of the age that Alamut, which the caliphs and the sultans had spent 166 years trying and failing to destroy, outlasted the caliphate itself by less than 2 years. The Mongol advance continued westward into Syria, where the smaller Nizari fortresses of the coastal range still stood, unmolested for the moment. Masyaf and its sister castles were now, in a certain sense, all that remained of the political structure that Hassanai Saba had built, and their masters watched the Mongol horsemen come down through Anatolia with the grim understanding that their turn was next. But in September of 1260, in a wide plain in Galilee called Ain Jalut, the Mongol advance was checked for the first time in its history. A Mamluk army out of Egypt, commanded by a former slave soldier named Baybars, met the Mongol advance guard in the open field and destroyed it. The Mongols withdrew eastward, and the western frontier of their empire settled along a line that would hold, more or less, for the next generation. The Syrian Nizari fortresses had been spared by an accident of geography and of timing, and they continued to stand upon their rocks. But they were no longer the outposts of a great order stretching from the Caspian to the Mediterranean. They were now the last remnants of a community whose heart had been burned upon the mountain in Persia, and they knew it. The man who had spared them, Baybars, was, as it happened, not much more sympathetic to their existence than Hulagu had been. Within a few years of his great victory at Ain Jalut, he had made himself Sultan of the Mamluk state in Cairo, and by the middle of the 1270s, he had set about, with the same methodical energy that he had shown against the Mongols and the Crusaders, reducing the Syrian Nizari fortresses one by one to the authority of his own government. He did not attempt to destroy the community as Hulagu had destroyed it in Persia. He proceeded by a mixture of pressure, negotiation, and the substitution of his own governors for the local Nizari masters, so that Masyaf and Cadmus and the other castles passed, over a period of about a decade, from being self-governing seats of the order into being ordinary Mamluk garrisons, in which small Nizari communities continued to live under new masters. The last of the Syrian fortresses to come under Mamluk control did so around 1273, which is, by a strange coincidence of the calendar, almost exactly the year in which Marco Polo was riding through the ruins of Alamut and hearing the stories of the drugged garden that would fix the sect forever in the European imagination. And here is the point at which the story I have been telling, if I stopped it now, would leave you with an ending as clean and as final as the ending of any great tragedy. The order had risen. The order had ruled its mountains for 166 years. The Mongols had come. The library had burned. The last master had been killed on the road. The Syrian branch had been quietly absorbed into the Mamluk state. And the whole vast, delicate structure of the Nizari community, so it might appear, had simply ceased to exist somewhere between the fires of 1256 and the surrender of Masyaf in the 1270s. But this is not what happened. This is only what appeared from the outside to have happened, and the appearance is one more piece of the misunderstanding that has always surrounded the order. The truth is that the community did not cease to exist at all. It went quiet. It went underground. It went, one might say, back into the condition of prudent concealment out of which Hassanai Saba had first drawn it more than a century and a half earlier, and in that condition it survived, generation by generation, in the villages of the mountains, and in the small towns of the plateau, and in the migrating communities that carried it eventually into lands the founder had never seen. Recall that from the very beginning, from the announcement at Alamut in the summer of 1164, the Nizari doctrine had known perfectly well how to live in the world of the outer forms while preserving its inner life. The great return to the Sunni forms of practice under Jalal al-Din Hassan in the early 13th century had been, whatever else it was, a rehearsal of exactly the technique that the community would now need. The scattered Nizari families of the villages beneath the ruined castles simply continued to do what they had already learned to do. They kept the outer observances of whichever form of Islam the surrounding power required, and they kept, in the privacy of their own homes, and in the quiet transmission from parent to child, the inner life of the tradition. In the mountain valleys of Persia, and in the coastal ranges of Syria, and in the isolated communities of Khorasan, and in a further and more distant region that would become important as the centuries went on, the Nizari faith went on being taught, and the memory of the line of the Imams was preserved, and the small daily disciplines of prayer and charity and mutual assistance among the faithful were maintained. The imamate itself, which had stood at the theological center of the community from the very beginning, did not fail either. In the confusion of the fall of Alamut, a young grandson of the last master had been carried away by loyal servants and taken to safety in a distant part of the country. From him, the line continued, generation by generation, in circumstances of great obscurity, so that for several centuries after the fall, the ordinary Nizari villagers in most parts of the world did not know exactly where their imam was living or under what name he was passing his days, though they knew he existed, and they held themselves in readiness for the moment when he or one of his descendants would once again make himself known to the community. This is precisely the condition of latent expectation in which Shia communities have often lived, and the Nizaris were now living it in a form perhaps more thoroughgoing than any of their coreligionists. There is a region I mentioned a moment ago that becomes important as the centuries move on. It lies far to the east of the old heartland of the order, in what is today the Indian subcontinent, and it had been reached by Nizari missionaries in the ordinary way, walking the trade routes, taking service in the towns, teaching quietly in the shops and the markets. Over the centuries after the fall of Alamut, the Nizari community in the Indian subcontinent grew, absorbing local converts, adapting its outer forms to the languages and customs of the country, developing a distinctive body of devotional poetry in the vernacular languages of the region that expressed the Ismaili faith in imagery drawn from the surrounding culture. By the 18th century, this community was probably larger and certainly more prosperous than the surviving communities in Persia and Syria, and it was to become, in a certain sense, the new center of gravity of the whole Nizari world. The line of the Imams, meanwhile, had, over the same centuries, gradually made itself less obscure, moving from the deep concealment of the immediate post-Alamut generations into a more open but still cautious existence in the towns of central Persia, and eventually into a fully public position under the Qajar dynasty of Iran in the early 19th century. The Imam of that period, a man named Hassan Ali Shah, was for a time the governor of the Persian province of Kerman under the Qajar Shah, and it was from the Shah himself that he received the honorific title by which the Imams of the Nizari community have been known ever since, which was Aga Khan, a Persian and Turkish compound meaning something like Lord Master. He fell out with the Shah eventually, in the way of powerful men in 19th century Persia, and he made his way, after some adventures, into the neighboring dominions of British India, where he was received with respect, and where he found among the large and prosperous Nizari community of the subcontinent a base of support and reverence, such as no imam of the community had enjoyed for many centuries. He settled in Bombay, and his descendants have continued to lead the community from a position of open and public authority from that day to this. The present imam, the Aga Khan, is his direct descendant in the male line, and the community he leads numbers, in the world today, some 15 million people, spread across a great many countries, from the mountain villages of the old Persian heartland to the towns of East Africa and the cities of Europe and North America. What is striking about the modern Nizari community, and this is the point that so completely inverts the popular image of the order that it deserves to be stated as plainly as possible, is that it is one of the most peaceable religious communities in the modern world. The Aga Khan Development Network, which is the great charitable and educational institution through which the present Imam and his followers carry on their public work, funds schools and universities and hospitals and rural development projects and cultural preservation programs and microfinance institutions across many of the poorest regions of Asia and Africa. It supports architectural conservation and the preservation of Islamic scholarly heritage. It funds a great university in London devoted to the study of Ismaili and other Muslim traditions, which has done more than any other institution in the world to recover, from the surviving fragments, the true history of the order whose story we have been telling this evening. The men and women who follow the present Aga Khan are, in their overwhelming majority, doctors and teachers and shopkeepers and farmers and civil servants, going about the ordinary business of their lives, and they are known in the countries where they live for their high levels of education, their careful stewardship of their communities, and their quiet and steady contribution to civic life. This is what the descendants of Alamut in the 21st century have become. We have followed, tonight, a story that began with a scholar reading late into the night in a Persian town in the middle of the 11th century, and that has brought us, by way of a mountain fortress, a series of daggers upon pillows, a great fire in a library, and a Venetian traveller with a talent for embroidery, all the way to the schools and hospitals of the modern Aga Khan Development Network. It is a strange arc for any human story to follow, and it is worth pausing before we let the day go entirely to say a few things about what it means, and about how much of what we thought we knew when we began has turned out to be something other than what it seemed. The first thing worth saying is that the Nizari order was not, in any sense that would be useful to a modern reader, an order of assassins. It contained, at any given time, a very small number of men trained for the particular kind of public killing that we saw at work in the deaths of Nizam al-Mulk in 1092, and in the various pillar warnings that punctuated the 12th century. And those men were called Fid, a letter to Beis, not assassins, and they went to their missions in the discipline of a religious calling that had nothing whatever to do with drugs or with false paradises. The great mass of the community, the tens of thousands of ordinary Nizari men and women in the villages of Persia and Syria and Kohistan, and later, the Indian subcontinent, lived lives that were indistinguishable from the lives of their Muslim neighbors, except in the quiet particulars of their inner faith. The image of a whole community organized around murder is, on the plain evidence of the sources, absurd, and it is the product of a very specific historical accident, which is that the sect's enemies were the ones who got to write its history after its own library burned. The second thing worth saying is that the political method for which the order became famous, the method of the single carefully chosen public killing carried out by an agent who accepted death, was not, from the point of view of the men who used it, a technique of terror in the modern sense. It was, in their own understanding, a technique of restraint. They possessed no army capable of meeting the Seljuk Empire in the field. They possessed no treasury capable of buying the loyalty of great numbers of soldiers. They possessed, in the whole world, a few thousand followers and a handful of fortresses, and they were surrounded by powers that could have destroyed them 100 times over if they had chosen to bear the cost. The method Hassanai Saba worked out, in the long nights on the rock of Alamut in the early 1090s, was the method by which such a community could survive at all in such a world. It spent lives, yes, but it spent them one at a time, in the presence of witnesses, in circumstances designed to make it perfectly clear to every other powerful man in the region what the arrangement was. And its effect, over the century and a half that followed, was to make possible the peaceful coexistence of the Nizari communities with the powers around them, at a cost in blood that was, by the standards of the wars of that age, remarkably small. Whether one thinks that this makes it a defensible technique or not is a question I am not going to try to answer for you tonight. It is a hard question, and it belongs to the daylight, not to the hour in which you and I are talking. But it is worth understanding, before one condemns or admires the technique, that this is what it actually was. The third thing worth saying is about the library, and about what was lost when it burned. Ata Malik Juvani tells us, in the pages of his history, that he took from the shelves of Alamut certain books that seemed to him worth saving, and that he stood by while the rest were consigned to the flames. It is easy, sitting many centuries later, to be angry with him for not saving more. But he was a Persian scholar in the train of a Mongol conqueror, working under conditions of extreme delicacy, and the fact that he saved anything at all is a small mercy in a story that is otherwise very short on mercies. What we have of the Nizari tradition today, in the great libraries of the world, comes to us in significant part through what he carried out of that burning fortress in the winter of 1256, together with what was preserved in the more distant communities that his masters did not reach. It is not enough to reconstruct the tradition as its own writers would have wished it reconstructed. It is enough to give us a plain sense of what the tradition was, which is that it was a serious, philosophically sophisticated, and deeply Islamic form of Shia devotion, and not the cartoon of drugged fanaticism that Marco Polo and his heirs bequeathed to the popular imagination. And here is the fourth thing worth saying, which is the strangest, and in some ways the most affecting. The order that stood upon the rock of Alamut in the middle of the 13th century believed itself to be the community of the last age, the community of the resurrection, the community whose imam stood in a special relationship to the hidden meaning of the faith. When Hulagu's engineers pulled down the walls of the fortress and the library burned in the closed chambers below, everything in the outer condition of the community suggested that this belief had been mistaken. The imam was dead. The imamate had been broken. The community was scattered. The great enterprise that Hassanai Saba had begun in 1090 had, by every reasonable measure, ended in the most complete failure that any religious community of the medieval world could have imagined for itself. And yet the community did not end. It did what it had always known how to do. It went quiet. It kept the outer forms of the world it found itself in. It preserved, in the privacy of homes and villages, the inner life of the tradition. It waited, and over the centuries that followed, it emerged again in shapes that Hassanai Sabbah upon his rock could not possibly have foreseen, and in a form that would have astonished the Seljuk viziers and the Mamluk sultans and the Mongol khans who had tried, each in his own way, to make an end of it. The fifth thing, and this is perhaps the deepest thing to say about the whole strange story, is that what the modern Nizari community has become is not, in any sense that could reasonably be called a rebranding or a repositioning, a departure from the tradition that Hassanai Sabbah founded. It is a continuation of it. The great work that Hassan set his order to do upon the rock of Alamut was, at bottom, the work of the missionary teachers, the deis, whom he sent out into the towns to persuade one careful convert at a time. The killings and the daggers and the mountain fortresses were, in his own understanding, the means by which the space was cleared for that teaching to go on. When the outer power of the order was destroyed by the Mongols, what remained was the inner work, which was the work of the teaching community, and it is precisely that work, on a vast modern scale, that the schools and universities and hospitals of the Aga Khan Development Network are now carrying on. The community that once had to protect its teachers by frightening the sultans out of interfering with them, now builds a university in London, where its tradition can be studied openly by scholars of every faith, and funds a network of schools across the poorest regions of the world, where the ordinary children of ordinary families can learn to read. Whether one wishes to say that this is what Hassanai Sabbah was always trying to build, or whether one wishes to say that it is what his community became once history had taken away from it the harder tools of an earlier age, is a matter of interpretation. What is not a matter of interpretation is that the community which was going to be extinguished, which was going to be reduced to a memory in a ruined valley, is instead alive and numerous, and by every ordinary measure of a religious community's contribution to the well-being of the world, doing well. There is one final image I want to leave you with tonight, because it seems to me to capture the whole story better than any argument could. In the year 1256, when Hulagu's army was on the point of taking Alamut and Rukan al-Din was preparing to descend from the rock, there stood in a certain small chamber of the fortress a garden. Not the drugged and legendary garden of Marco Polo's tale, which never existed, but the ordinary working garden of the mountain lords, planted with fruit trees and vegetable beds, and watered by the channels that carried the snowmelt down from the peaks above. It had been tended, generation after generation, since Hassanai Sabbah had first climbed to the fortress in the disguise of a school teacher in 1090. It was, by that autumn of 1256, an old garden, and when the Mongols came, and the walls came down, and the fires burned in the library, that garden was pulled up like everything else. The apricot trees were cut, and the channels were broken, and the beds were left to the wind and the snow, and the valley below Alamut passed, for a long time, out of the notice of the world. But in the villages of that valley, and in 1,000 other villages between the Caspian and the Arabian Sea, and in 1,000 other places even further away, ordinary Nizari families went on tending their own small gardens, planting their own apricot trees, teaching their own children the quiet inner life of their faith. And from those small gardens, kept alive through 8 centuries of concealment and quiet and patience, the whole modern community grew. It is not a bad image, I think, to carry with you into sleep tonight. A great fortress upon a rock, and a great library within it, and a great garden beside it, all of them broken in one terrible winter. And then, spreading outward from that ruin, quietly and without notice, 1,000 other gardens in 1,000 other places, going on with the work. And that is the story of the Order of Assassins, from a scholar's reading lamp in the year 1080 to the schools and hospitals of the 21st century. If you are still awake, there is another video waiting for you on the screen whenever you feel ready to keep the journey going. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought down in the comments. There is no rush. Set everything aside now. Rest easy. Let yourself settle into the pillow. Close your eyes and let the day go. Sleep well and sweet dreams.